If you were to step into the heart of Athens during its golden age, you would find that sexuality was not a private, shame-laden subject. The Greeks talked about it openly, celebrated it in festivals, and even used it as a tool for humor in their plays. Sex was not just something that happened behind closed doors. It was part of the visual language of the city. You might pass a workshop where a potter is painting a scene of a reclining couple on a wine cup, or walk by a temple adorned with carvings that hint at more than simple piety. The setting of ancient Greek life made sex hard to ignore. Homes were modest in size, and privacy was rare. Courtyards were shared, walls were thin, and servants often knew more about their master's romantic affairs than the spouses did. Nights were warm for much of the year, which meant open windows, drifting voices, and the occasional sound of beds creaking in the dark. Public spaces also played their part. The agora or marketplace was a place of business, but also of gossip. Rumors about who had taken a new lover could travel faster than a fishmonger shouting the day's catch. At banquets, known as symposiums, wine flowed freely, and conversations often wandered from philosophy to flirtation without missing a beat. For many Greeks, there was no hard line between the intellectual and the sensual. To understand sexuality in ancient Greece, you have to imagine a culture where beauty was considered a kind of virtue. A well-shaped body was seen as evidence of discipline and harmony, and this admiration extended naturally to desire. Sculptors chiseled idealized forms into marble, not just for the sake of art, but as a celebration of the physical self. A visitor from another time might see the statues of naked athletes and wonder if these were erotic or merely artistic. The answer is that in ancient Greece, the two were often the same thing. Yet, this openness did not mean equality. The rules of sexual conduct were shaped by a deeply hierarchical society. Men enjoyed freedoms that women did not, and sexual morality often depended more on social standing than on the act itself. A wealthy man might take a mistress without much scandal, while a woman caught in the same situation could face ruin. Sex was not just a private matter. It was a reflection of power, control, and public image. As you walk through this imagined city, you notice that the people do not blush when the topic comes up. Laughter and teasing are part of the conversation. In plays performed at festivals, entire crowds howl with amusement at exaggerated jokes about anatomy and infidelity. This humor was not a sign of immorality, but of a culture that saw sexuality as a natural and enduring part of the human condition. The architecture itself could invite thoughts of intimacy. Small houses with cool, shaded interiors gave way to rooftops where couples might escape for a few quiet moments under the night sky. Gardens filled with the scent of herbs could serve as secluded meeting places. Even the sea breeze carried with it a certain softness, a reminder that in this land, the boundary between pleasure and daily life was paper thin. There were, of course, moral voices. Philosophers like Socrates and Plato could turn discussions of love and desire into questions about virtue and the soul. Yet even they acknowledged that sexual attraction was part of the human experience. Their debates were not about whether sex was acceptable, but about how it should be guided and expressed. To live in ancient Greece was to live in a world where sex was both ordinary and celebrated. It could be an act of passion, a duty of marriage, or a form of entertainment. It could be a source of scandal or of pride. And for the people walking these streets, it was never far from their minds. By the time the city grows quiet and the lamps burn low, couples are retreating to their homes, lovers are slipping through narrow alleys, and the air is warm with the scent of oil and the faint, lingering sounds of the day's laughter. In the ancient Greek night, desire was as present as the stars above. In ancient Greece, love and desire were not simply human experiences. They were woven into the very fabric of religion and myth. To the Greeks, passion was not only natural, it was divine, a force that could be both a blessing and a curse. When they spoke about love, they often spoke about the gods who embodied it, inspired it, or punished it. The most famous, of course, was Aphrodite. She was not a modest figure draped in quiet virtue. She was beauty made flesh, the goddess of love, lust, and irresistible attraction. In statues and paintings, she is almost always in a moment of undress, or about to be, her expression calm but knowing. Her very presence suggested that desire was as much a part of life as breathing. The myths surrounding Aphrodite made it clear that beauty was power. She could start wars with a glance, as in the story of the Trojan War, sparked when Paris judged her more beautiful than two rival goddesses. In reward, she promised him the love of Helen, the most beautiful mortal woman alive. This was not just a love story. It was a reminder that sexual attraction could alter the fate of nations. Then there was Zeus, whose romantic pursuits were the stuff of endless gossip even in antiquity. If you believed the poets, the king of the gods spent more time chasing lovers than ruling Olympus. His affairs were legendary, involving goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women, often under questionable circumstances. He appeared in disguises, as a swan, a bull, even a shower of golden light, all in the pursuit of desire. To the Greeks, these tales were not only entertainment, but also a reflection of how irresistible passion could bend even the rules of the divine. Other gods played their part in shaping the Greek view of love and sex. Dionysus, god of wine and revelry, represented the wild, intoxicating side of desire. His festivals were filled with music, dancing, and the loosening of inhibitions. To honor Dionysus was to give in to pleasure without apology. Eros, often depicted as a playful youth with wings, embodied the sudden spark of attraction. He was not the cherubic figure of later traditions. In Greek thought, he was a powerful force that could disrupt reason and topple the most disciplined mind. When Eros struck, people acted without hesitation, for better or worse. Even goddesses associated with marriage and home life had roles in shaping attitudes toward sex. Hera, wife of Zeus, was the goddess of marriage, and while she was known for her jealousy, her domain acknowledged that sexual fidelity was an important part of wedded life. These myths were not just stories to tell by firelight. They were explanations for human behavior. When someone fell madly in love, they might say Aphrodite had favored them, or that Eros had struck them with an arrow. When lust led to trouble, they might blame the influence of Dionysus, or the trickery of a god who had taken an interest in mortal affairs. In art, the gods' sexual escapades were painted and carved openly. A temple might feature a scene of Aphrodite rising from the sea, her curves soft and inviting, while vases could show Zeus in one of his many pursuits. These images were not seen as indecent. They were part of a shared understanding that the divine world mirrored the human one, including its passions and flaws. For the Greeks, there was no single word that covered all forms of love. They used different terms for different kinds: eros for romantic or sexual love, philia for deep friendship, storge for familial affection, and agape for a more selfless love. This linguistic precision revealed a culture that thought carefully about the nature of connection, separating the erotic from the platonic, the fleeting desire from the enduring bond. Sex and love in Greek myth carried lessons, warnings, and celebrations. Some stories showed the joy of mutual attraction. Others showed the chaos that could follow when desire ran unchecked. The point was not to condemn the feelings themselves, but to acknowledge that they were forces to be respected, much like the sea or the wind. If you had lived then, hearing these stories in the soft glow of lamplight, you might have felt both entertained and cautioned. The message was clear. Love and desire could lift you to the heights of joy, but they could also send your life tumbling into disorder. The gods lived with this duality, and so did the people who worshipped them. In ancient Greece, to speak of love was to speak of the gods, and to speak of the gods was to admit that sex was not a side note in human life. It was central, a force worthy of myth, sculpture, and song. The divine and the intimate were never far apart. Marriage in ancient Greece was rarely a matter of romance. It was a contract, a binding agreement between families that had as much to do with land, money, and alliances as it did with love or attraction. Yet sex sat firmly at the center of it. Producing legitimate children was the most important duty of a wife, and this duty began almost as soon as she entered her husband's home. Weddings themselves were community events, rich with ritual. The bride, often in her early teens, would be led from her father's house to her new home in a ceremonial procession. Torches lit the way, music played, and relatives followed close behind. In the dim light, neighbors might gossip quietly about the match, whether the bride was beautiful, whether the groom was wealthy, and whether the union would be fruitful in the ways that mattered most. The night of the wedding was not a moment for slow courtship. In most cases, the first sexual encounter between husband and wife happened immediately. A physical act expected to seal the union. Privacy was limited. The household was aware of what was taking place, and sometimes wedding songs outside the room contained teasing, even suggestive verses acknowledging the event openly. In this world, sex between husband and wife was not primarily about pleasure, though that was not excluded. It was about lineage. A man's property and name passed to his legitimate sons, and without heirs, his family line risked fading away. A woman's role, from the perspective of the law and tradition, was to bear those heirs and maintain the household. That said, the Greeks did not necessarily see marriage as the only space for sexual fulfillment. Men of means often sought intimacy elsewhere, whether with courtesans, mistresses, or slaves. Wives, on the other hand, were expected to remain sexually faithful, and any deviation could bring severe consequences, from divorce to public shame. Married life for women was largely domestic. Most spent their days managing servants, weaving, and overseeing food preparation. The inner quarters of the home, known as the gynekon, were considered a woman's domain, and men did not linger there without reason. Sexual encounters between husband and wife could be frequent, especially in the early years, but they often followed a routine rather than spontaneous desire. Some marriages did, however, develop genuine affection. There are records of husbands praising their wives' beauty, wit, or kindness, suggesting that attraction and respect could grow over time. Still, the foundation was duty before passion. A couple could share a bed nightly for decades without ever considering themselves lovers in the modern sense. For the wealthy, marriage was also a means of forging political or business ties. A union could secure trade agreements, cement peace between rival families, or strengthen influence in the city's affairs. In this way, sex within marriage was part of a much larger network of social and economic interests. The rituals surrounding marriage reinforced the seriousness of its purpose. Offerings were made to Hera, the goddess of marriage, asking for fertility and harmony. Gifts were exchanged, and feasts were held where wine and food flowed freely. But even at these celebrations, there was an underlying recognition that what lay ahead for the bride was a life of duty. Much of it centered on the bedroom. For a modern visitor, this might seem cold or transactional. Yet, in ancient Greece, this arrangement was considered natural. Romantic love was more often associated with affairs, poetry, and the arts. Marriage was the bedrock of society, designed to preserve families and maintain order. Sex was the tool by which it was sustained. If you imagine yourself in that time, perhaps sitting in a courtyard on a warm night, you would see couples whose relationships were shaped by these expectations. You might notice the quiet companionship of long-married pairs, or the way newlyweds navigated the early awkwardness of their union. And you would understand that in ancient Greece, marriage was less about personal happiness and more about fulfilling a role in the grand, unbroken chain of family and tradition. To understand sex in ancient Greece, you have to understand the position of women. Their lives were shaped by laws, customs, and expectations that limited their freedom, yet their sexuality was still central to the society around them. It was guarded, controlled, and often spoken for by others. A woman's body was considered the property of her husband or father, and the sexual choices available to her were few. Most women married young, often around 14 or 15. From that point on, their sexual lives were tied almost entirely to their husbands. In the ideal view of Greek society, a respectable woman stayed indoors, ran the household, raised children, and avoided the public eye. Her virtue was measured by her modesty, and her modesty was guarded by keeping her away from situations where temptation or rumor could arise. This did not mean that women had no understanding of sex before marriage. In a culture where art and myth made sexuality visible, a young girl might already know what was expected of her. Wedding preparations often included rituals and stories that hinted at her new role as a wife. However, the realities of the wedding night, especially for someone so young, could be very different from what the songs and jokes suggested. Once married, a woman's sexual obligations were clear. She was expected to be available to her husband, especially when the goal was to produce children. Pleasure was not considered her primary role in the act, though ancient writers do occasionally acknowledge that women could experience and enjoy desire. Some medical texts even argued that female pleasure could help with conception, a belief that may have given some women a slightly stronger place in intimate moments. Yet outside of marriage, the rules were strict. An unmarried woman from a citizen family who engaged in sexual relations risked her future entirely. If caught, she could be married off in haste, shamed, or even barred from participating in certain public religious rituals. For a married woman, adultery was one of the few offenses that could strip her of her reputation and protection completely. For men, the situation was different. A husband's sexual encounters outside marriage were not automatically seen as betrayal, provided they did not involve another citizen's wife. The double standard was open and accepted. A man might keep a mistress, visit courtesans, or take sexual partners among his slaves without risking the same level of public outrage. For a woman, even the suspicion of infidelity could be devastating. Some women, however, lived outside these strict domestic limits. Priestesses in certain temples had more freedom of movement, and in rare cases, wealthier women could manage their own estates or travel more openly. But these were exceptions. For the vast majority, life revolved around the home, and their sexual world was defined almost entirely by the boundaries of marriage. In literature and plays, women's sexuality was often a subject of fascination, fear, or humor. Comic playwrights made bawdy jokes about unfaithful wives or lustful women. while tragedies sometimes cast women's desires as dangerous forces that could bring down men and kingdoms alike. These stories reflected a deep cultural tension. Women's sexuality was necessary for society's survival, yet it was also seen as something that needed to be controlled. Still, there were hints of agency. In private moments, some women likely found ways to influence the pace and nature of intimacy. Household servants might act as go-betweens, passing messages or arranging secret meetings. Though the risks were high, human desire has a way of finding paths through even the strictest social walls. If you imagine yourself as a woman in ancient Greece, you would live in a world where your sexual life was never entirely your own. It was tied to your family's honor, your husband's reputations, and the unspoken rules that kept the city's structure intact. And yet, behind the closed doors of the Gynekon, the daily realities of love, frustration, and intimacy would play out much as they do in any age, quietly, imperfectly, and in ways that could not be fully controlled by law or tradition. In a society that placed such heavy emphasis on marriage as a duty, it is no surprise that many Greeks looked beyond their official unions for passion. Mistresses, affairs, and secret lovers formed a quiet but persistent thread in the fabric of ancient life. These relationships could be dangerous, but they also offered something marriage often lacked: choice, novelty, and the thrill of breaking rules. For men, taking a mistress was not always frowned upon, provided certain boundaries were respected. The most important rule was to avoid the wives of other citizen men. To seduce another man's wife was not merely an insult, it was an attack on his household and his honor. In Athens, if a man was caught in the act with someone else's wife, the husband had the legal right to kill him on the spot. That was not an empty threat. The law recognized adultery as a direct challenge to the legitimacy of children and the stability of the family line. Mistresses often came from outside the citizen class. They might be foreigners, slaves, or freedwomen. Some were courtesans, educated companions skilled in conversation, music, and the arts, who could offer both intimacy and intellectual engagement. Others were household servants, where proximity made discretion both easier and more dangerous. For women, affairs were riskier. A married woman who took a lover risked her marriage, her home, and even her place in society. If caught, she could be divorced instantly and barred from participating in public religious life. Yet despite these risks, infidelity did occur. Some stories survive in plays and court speeches, where accusations of illicit meetings and nighttime visits were used to scandalize or shame an opponent. The practicalities of conducting an affair in ancient Greece required careful planning. Secrecy was essential. Lovers might meet during festivals, when crowds and noise provided cover, or send messages through trusted servants. Urban homes, with their small rooms and shared walls, made privacy scarce, so timing was everything. In some cases, affairs unfolded in the back rooms of shops, in garden courtyards, or even during religious processions, where the press of the crowd hid quick exchanges. Passion was only one motive. Affairs could also be about influence, gifts, or escape from the monotony of daily life. A wealthy man might maintain a long-term mistress, providing her with housing and support. In return, she offered companionship that was free from the rigid expectations of a wife. For some women, especially courtesans, this arrangement provided a measure of independence in a society where few options existed outside marriage. Literature often reflects the fascination with forbidden desire. Poets wrote about lovers who could not stay apart, even at great risk. In comedy, affairs were treated as opportunities for bawdy humor, with scheming servants and clueless husbands. In tragedy, they could lead to ruin, death, or war. The underlying message was always the same. The pull of desire was powerful enough to defy law, duty, and reputation. If you picture yourself in this world, perhaps standing in the shadow of a columned stoa, you might notice a man slipping away from a banquet earlier than expected, or a woman lingering just a little too long in conversation with someone who is not her husband. These were the quiet signals of affairs in motion, the subtle rhythms of a society that spoke one way in public and lived another in private. Mistresses and lovers were rarely acknowledged openly, but their presence was felt in the city's gossip, in the hints left in love poems, and in the occasional scandal that burst into public view. In a culture that celebrated beauty and desire yet tied marriage to duty and lineage, forbidden relationships were almost inevitable. They were the spaces where passion could run freer, though never without the shadow of risk. If affairs were the hidden undercurrent of Greek society, courtesans and concubines were the openly acknowledged alternative to wives. These women occupied a space outside the rules that confined most citizen wives, and in doing so, they could wield a kind of influence that was rare for women in the ancient world. The Greeks had a word for the most celebrated of these women, hetairi. The term meant companions, but it implied much more than physical intimacy. Hetairi were often educated, witty, and skilled in music, dance, and conversation. They could attend symposiums where citizen wives never went, and they were free to speak their minds in mixed company. Their relationships with men could be both sexual and intellectual, and this combination made them highly sought after. A man might visit a hetaira not just for sex, but for her ability to entertain, to debate philosophy, to tell a story that made him laugh, or to offer counsel in matters of love and politics. In a world where most women were kept away from public life, hetairi could move in spaces normally reserved for men. Some became famous in their own time, their reputations enduring in the writings of poets and historians. Concubines occupied a different role. They might be slaves, freedwomen, or foreign-born partners who lived with a man without the legal reputation of a wife. A concubine's position was more stable than that of a casual lover, yet less secure than that of a wife. She might bear children, but those children would not have the full rights of citizenship unless certain legal steps were taken. For wealthy men, concubines could be part of a carefully managed household, alongside a wife and perhaps even a mistress. Symposiums, the evening banquets that combined drinking, music, and conversation, were key spaces for the presence of courtesans. These gatherings could begin respectably, with philosophical discussion and poetry recitations, but as the night wore on and the wine flowed, they often shifted toward flirtation and more intimate entertainment. Hetairi might dance, sing, or engage in playful banter, blurring the lines between performance and seduction. The relationship between a man and his courtesan could be long-lasting. While marriage bound people together for duty, a connection with a hetaira was chosen freely. This could make the bond more personal, though it was still shaped by the economics of the arrangement. Gifts, money, and favors were part of the exchange, and a man's continued generosity often ensured continued access. Some courtesans navigated these relationships with remarkable skill, securing wealth and influence. They could own property, hire servants, and even act as patrons to artists or poets. Their lives stood in sharp contrast to the seclusion of most Greek women, though their freedom always depended on maintaining favor with wealthy and powerful men. In art and literature, courtesans were often portrayed with a mix of admiration and moral caution. They could be romanticized as muses or criticized as dangerous temptresses. Plays might show them outsmarting naive lovers, while poems might immortalize them as the unforgettable face in a man's life. If you imagine yourself at a symposium, reclining on a couch with a cup of wine in hand, you might watch as a hetaira enters the room. She would move with confidence, greet the guests by name, and offer a few clever words that make everyone smile. Later, she might sit beside you, her perfume mixing with the scent of the oil lamps, her laughter carrying across the room. The conversation could turn to politics or to love, and either way, she would hold her ground as an equal in the exchange. Courtesans and concubines were part of the accepted sexual landscape of ancient Greece. They were not bound by the same rules as wives, and that made them both desirable and, in some eyes, dangerous. They lived in the space between respectability and scandal, where pleasure, wit, and companionship could flourish without the formalities of marriage. In ancient Greece, sex was not always confined to the home. Public and semi-public spaces often carried a charge of flirtation, suggestion, and sometimes even opportunity. These places were not necessarily scenes of open intimacy, but they created the conditions in which sexual encounters could begin, and in some cases, take place. The symposium was one of the most important of these spaces. Part banquet, part drinking party, it was a setting where men reclined on couches, drank wine, and listened to music or poetry. While official wives were never present, courtesans and entertainers were welcome. Here, conversation often drifted from philosophy to erotic stories, and the mood could shift from formal to playful in a matter of minutes. By the end of the night, some guests left with more than a philosophical idea to ponder. Festivals also blurred the lines between public celebration and private pleasure. Many religious events included processions, dances, and theatrical performances filled with sexual humor and innuendo. During these gatherings, the usual restrictions on behavior loosened. People mingled freely in the streets, masks were worn, and the anonymity of the crowd could make chance encounters possible. Bathhouses were another space where sexuality lingered just beneath the surface. Public bathing was common, and while men and women generally bathed separately, the atmosphere could be relaxed and unguarded. Conversations happened in close quarters, and the sight of the body was not treated with the same level of secrecy as in later cultures. Theatre itself was a kind of public space where sex was discussed openly, if not acted out. Comedies by playwrights such as Aristophanes were filled with crude jokes, exaggerated gestures, and outrageous situations. The entire city could laugh together at a scene that hinted strongly at infidelity or lust, and in doing so, reinforced the shared understanding that sex was a part of life to be acknowledged rather than hidden. Markets, too, could be surprisingly intimate places. In the bustle of buying and selling, conversations could turn personal. Traders and customers might exchange more than goods. The stalls provided moments for lingering glances or coded compliments, particularly during quieter hours when the crowd thinned. Then there were the more discreet venues, back rooms of taverns, shaded corners of gardens, and small rooms above shops. These spaces were not officially devoted to sex, but everyone knew they were sometimes used for that purpose. Some brothels operated openly, while others disguised themselves as inns or private homes. For a modern visitor, the level of sexual openness in these public settings might be surprising. It was not that people in ancient Greece were constantly engaging in acts in front of others, but rather that the presence of sexuality in conversation, art, and environment was accepted. It could be joked about, hinted at, or even celebrated without automatically becoming scandalous. Imagine yourself at a festival in Athens. The air is warm, music is playing, and torches light the streets in flickering gold. You are pressed among dancers and spectators, the smell of wine heavy in the air. Someone brushes against you, smiles, and says something teasing. You might never see them again, or you might find yourself later in a quieter corner, speaking in low voices while the crowd roars somewhere far behind. Sex in ancient Greece could begin in many places, over a cup of wine, in a marketplace stall, or beneath the stands at a theatre. These public and social spaces were not just backdrops to daily life. They were the stages on which attraction could spark and grow, feeding into the private encounters that followed. For all the easy jokes and open conversations about sex in ancient Greece, there was a complex web of rules that decided what was acceptable and what was not. These were not only legal boundaries, but also social ones, shaped by a mix of tradition, religion, and community opinion. Some rules were written into law. Others lived only in the expectations of neighbors, family, and friends. One of the clearest divisions was between sex that supported the structure of society and sex that threatened it. If intimacy reinforced the household through marriage, childbearing, or relationships that did not disrupt social order, it was usually accepted. If it risked dishonor, confusion about inheritance, or public scandal, it was considered dangerous. There were restrictions tied to social standing. Citizen women were guarded closely, but women from outside the citizen class were often treated differently. Foreign women, slaves, and freed women could have sexual relationships with men without sparking the same kind of outrage, though they still lived within their own set of boundaries. Their reputations could suffer, but their actions rarely caused the kind of public uproar that came with dishonoring a citizen household. Religious boundaries could be just as strict. Some festivals, such as the Thesmophoria, a women-only event honoring Demeter, barred men entirely, with punishments for anyone who intruded. In other cases, sexual abstinence was required before certain rituals, not as a moral judgment, but as a way of approaching the gods in a state of purity. This could mean refraining from intimacy for days beforehand, with the belief that it made the worship more pleasing or respectful. There were also limits on when and where sex could happen. While privacy was scarce in Greek homes, there was still an expectation that certain spaces were off-limits. Temples, public assembly areas, and certain sacred groves were places where sexual activity was considered deeply disrespectful. Violating those boundaries was seen not just as improper, but as inviting divine anger. In the world of performance, rules could be bent but not completely broken. Comedies might depict outrageous scenes, but the actors were still subject to laws about public indecency. A play could hint heavily at a sexual act, use costumes to exaggerate anatomy, and make the audience roar with laughter, but it could not cross into genuine, unsimulated acts on stage. The line between suggestive entertainment and punishable obscenity was carefully maintained. Another unwritten rule was discretion. Public boasting about one's conquests could harm a man's reputation just as much as a scandal could. Moderation was a virtue in Greek culture, and someone known for excessive indulgence in sex could be mocked as lacking self-control. The ideal was not complete restraint, but balance, the ability to enjoy pleasure without being ruled by it. Even when the law allowed something, custom could frown upon it. For example, a man could legally keep both a wife and a concubine, but if he favored the concubine too openly, he risked damaging his standing among peers. It was one thing to have certain freedoms. It was another to exercise them without tact. If you stood in the middle of an Athenian street, listening to the mix of merchants calling out their goods, children playing, and neighbors gossiping, you would notice that these rules were understood without needing to be written down. People knew where the lines were. They also knew that stepping too far over them might mean more than a fine or a legal penalty. It could mean the quiet turning away of friends, the loss of trust, and the kind of social isolation that no one wanted in a city where reputation was everything. In this way, the Greeks managed a balance. Sex was a part of public life, celebrated and joked about, yet surrounded by invisible fences. Most people learned early how to move freely within them, and when to slow down before crossing into territory that could not be crossed back. If you wanted to understand how comfortable the Greeks were with sexuality, you would only need to walk through a potter's quarter or sit in the audience of a comedy. Erotic art and performance were part of public life, not something tucked away in secret collections. Desire was painted, carved, and spoken aloud, as much a part of the culture as politics or sport. Greek pottery is one of the most direct windows into their erotic imagination. On the surface, many pieces were purely functional: wine cups, oil flasks, and storage jars. Yet some were decorated with scenes that left little to the imagination. Red figure and black figure techniques allowed artists to depict intimate moments with remarkable clarity. Couples reclined together, bodies positioned with a mixture of elegance and realism. Sometimes the scenes were tender, sometimes they were playful, with exaggerated expressions that bordered on comic. These painted vases often told small stories. A figure might be shown handing a lover a garland, or playing a flute while reclining beside them. The inclusion of everyday objects, sandals kicked aside, wine jugs within reach, made the scenes feel familiar, like a glimpse into a private moment that was part of ordinary life. Sculpture treated the nude form as an art in itself. Male athletes were celebrated for their symmetry and strength, their bodies polished smooth as marble could allow. Female figures were often draped in thin fabrics that revealed as much as they concealed. The sculptor's skill lay in suggesting motion and life, so that even a still statue could seem caught in a fleeting moment of desire. Erotic themes also appeared in literature. Poets like Sappho wrote verses that spoke of longing with a directness that still resonates centuries later. Others used humor and clever wordplay to disguise erotic meaning beneath layers of metaphor, allowing the listener to enjoy the game of decoding it. In some cases, the metaphor was so thin that decoding was hardly necessary. Theatre was perhaps the most public stage for erotic humor. Comedies often featured characters with oversized costume appendages, exaggerated for laughs. The jokes could be outrageous, full of innuendo, yet they were performed for audiences that included politicians, philosophers, and merchants alike. The laughter was a shared acknowledgement that sex was part of life, and pretending otherwise would have been absurd. Even in religious art, eroticism was present. Certain festivals honored gods and goddesses associated with fertility, and their symbols were openly displayed. A procession might carry large representations of phalluses through the streets, not as crude jokes, but as serious invocations of prosperity and abundance. In this context, the erotic was not merely entertainment, it was tied to the survival and flourishing of the community. These artistic expressions did not always aim for subtlety. Some pottery scenes were explicit enough to surprise a modern viewer used to thinking of the past as more modest. Yet for the Greeks, the body and its desires were not inherently shameful. They were subjects worthy of craft and creativity. Imagine yourself in a workshop, watching a potter apply the final strokes. The figures on the cup lean toward one another, a hand resting lightly on a shoulder, a half smile frozen in clay. Later, that cup might be used at a symposium. The image slowly revealed as wine is drained, prompting a round of laughter or a knowing nod among the guests. Through these works, in clay, stone, poetry, and performance. The Greeks left a record of how they saw sex, as something to be celebrated, examined, and woven into the rhythm of daily life. Their art made desire visible, not as a private indulgence, but as a shared human experience worth capturing for all to see. Sex was also woven into religious life, where intimacy, fertility, and the divine often shared the same space. For the Greeks, the body was not a barrier to the sacred. In certain contexts, it was a bridge. Many festivals celebrated fertility directly. The worship of Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire, was one of the most obvious links between sex and religion. Her temples were adorned with offerings that spoke openly of attraction, carved figurines, delicate perfumes, and garlands of flowers. Some rituals invited participants to pray not just for beauty or love, but for sexual fulfillment, harmonious marriages, or the blessing of children. The cult of Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy, took this further. His festivals were charged with energy, marked by music, dance, and the loosening of social restraints. Participants wore masks, carried symbols of fertility, and sometimes engaged in acts meant to dissolve the normal boundaries between individuals. In honoring Dionysus, worshippers embraced the idea that pleasure could bring them closer to the divine, that surrendering to desire could be a form of spiritual experience. There were also fertility rites tied to agriculture, where sexual symbolism was central. In these ceremonies, the planting of seeds, the plowing of earth, and the growth of crops were often linked directly to human reproduction. Processions might carry large phallic symbols through the streets, not as crude displays, but as blessings for abundance in both the fields and the home. Some accounts suggest that sacred prostitution existed in certain Greek cities, most famously in Corinth, where priestesses of Aphrodite were said to welcome worshippers in acts meant to honor the goddess. Whether this was common or rare, the idea reflects a belief that sexual union could itself be an offering, a way of aligning human pleasure with divine favor. Other religious practices used abstinence instead of indulgence. Before certain rituals, participants might refrain from sex for days, approaching the gods in a state of ritual purity. In this way, both extremes, sexual celebration and sexual restraint, could be seen as pathways to the sacred. The choice depended on the nature of the god being honored and the purpose of the ceremony. Marriage rituals also carried a strong religious element. Offerings to Hera, goddess of marriage, were meant to ensure harmony and fertility. On the wedding night, some couples made small sacrifices to household gods before consummation, acknowledging that their union was part of a larger cosmic and social order. Even myths reinforced the link between sexuality and divine will. The stories of gods pursuing mortal lovers were not only tales of desire, but also explanations for sacred places and rituals. A temple might stand where a god was said to have met a beloved, turning a moment of intimacy into a site of lasting worship. If you imagine yourself in this world, you might stand in the midst of a festival for Aphrodite, the air rich with the scent of incense and flowers. Around you, people laugh, sing, and exchange small gifts that carry hidden meanings. Priests chant, dancers move in slow circles, and the boundary between sacred and sensual feels thin enough to step across without noticing. In ancient Greece, religion did not treat sex as a distraction from spiritual life. Instead, it recognized desire as a force the gods themselves commanded, blessed, and sometimes embodied. Whether through indulgence or abstinence, through private vows or public celebration, sexuality was one of the ways humans reached toward the divine. Physical beauty was described with precision. Men were often praised for symmetry, muscle tone, and a balanced build, the kind sculptors immortalized in marble. Women's beauty was tied to softness of skin, the brightness of eyes, and the grace of movement. Pale skin was admired in women of higher reputation, a sign that they spent their days indoors, away from the sun. For men, a healthy bronze tone from athletic training outdoors was equally desirable. Grooming played an important role in attraction. Perfumed oils were popular, both for their scent and for the sheen they gave to skin. Hair was carefully styled, long and curled for some, short and neat for others, and could be adorned with ribbons or headbands. Cleanliness was considered essential, and bathing was as much a part of preparation for intimacy as conversation or clothing. Clothing itself could be an instrument of seduction. While garments like the chiton and himation were simple in design, they could be arranged to reveal or conceal strategically. A woman might let her shoulders slip free from the fabric in a way that seemed accidental. A man might wear his cloak loosely after athletic training, offering a glimpse of his chest. These were small, calculated moments designed to catch the eye. But beauty in ancient Greece was never just physical. Wit, charm, and the ability to hold a conversation could enhance attraction as much as looks. At symposiums, courtesans and entertainers used clever remarks and storytelling to capture attention. Even among ordinary people, verbal skill could be a form of seduction. A well-placed compliment, a teasing observation, or a shared joke could open the door to something more. There was also the matter of scent. Fragrant oils made from roses, violets, or cinnamon were considered highly seductive. Some were imported from far-off lands, expensive enough to be used only on special occasions. The lingering trace of such a perfume could be as memorable as a face. Athletics played a surprising role in sexual appeal. Gymnasiums were central to Greek life, and training was often done nude. This was not only practical for movement, but also a celebration of the body itself. Watching athletes compete or exercise was both a social event and, for some, a form of discreet admiration. The ideal body was seen as a reflection of discipline, balance, and health, qualities that carried over into desirability. The Greeks also recognized that beauty changed with age. Youth was celebrated for its freshness and vitality, but maturity carried its own appeal. A confident older man or woman with social standing could attract through reputation, experience, and the kind of self-assurance that comes from having lived well. If you imagine yourself in this setting, you might be in a shaded courtyard, hearing the soft murmur of conversation and the splash of water in a nearby fountain. Someone passes close enough for you to catch the scent of perfumed oil, their clothing just loose enough to hint at the lines beneath. They smile, say something quick and clever, and in that instant you feel the subtle interplay of appearance, voice, and presence that the Greeks understood so well. In ancient Greece, beauty was not a static quality. It was a performance, a way of carrying oneself, a blend of care for the body and skill in social exchange. Attraction was built from 1,000 small choices, each one adding to the impression left in another's mind. And when those choices worked together, the result could be as compelling as any work of art. Desire in ancient Greece was not seen as something that vanished with age. It might change shape, soften, or slow, but it did not disappear. For many, the later years of life brought a different kind of intimacy. Less urgent, more deliberate, and often rooted in companionship. The Greeks valued youth for its vitality, but they also recognized the pleasures that came with maturity. An older man or woman might no longer fit the idealized images carved into marble, but experience, confidence, and social standing could create their own allure. In plays and poetry, Older lovers were sometimes teased for their persistence, yet they were also depicted as wise enough to savor what they had, rather than chase endlessly after what they did not. For couples who had spent decades together, intimacy could take quieter forms. Conversation by lamplight, a shared meal, a familiar touch in the courtyard. These moments carried the weight of years. Sex might happen less often, but when it did, it was shaped by deep familiarity. Partners knew each other's rhythms, preferences, and ways of moving through the world. The physical act became part of a larger bond, not the only measure of closeness. In households where marriages were arranged young, it was not unusual for couples to grow into genuine affection over time. A man who had once sought passion elsewhere might, in later years, find comfort and companionship in the partner who had shared his home for decades. For women, especially those who had raised children and managed a household, the quieter years could bring more freedom to enjoy the company of their husband without the constant pressure of bearing heirs. Greek philosophy often reflected on the balance between pleasure and moderation, and some thinkers suggested that the later years were the best time for true intimacy. Without the distractions of youthful competition or the urgency of proving oneself, love could be enjoyed without pretense. The pleasures of the body were complemented by those of the mind. Conversation, shared memories, and a mutual understanding built slowly over a lifetime. Even in old age, beauty was not forgotten. Wrinkles, grey hair, and slower movements were acknowledged as part of life's natural progression, not flaws to hide in shame. In art, older figures were often depicted with dignity, sometimes seated in a position of respect, suggesting that their worth was not diminished by the passing years. If you imagine yourself here, it might be a warm evening in a small village far from the bustle of Athens. You sit outside with someone you have known for most of your life. The wine is light. The air smells faintly of thyme from the hills, and the conversation drifts easily between the past and the present. There is no need for performance or artifice. The connection is steady, familiar, and deeply human. In the end, the Greeks understood that desire was not just a matter of youth or beauty. It was about connection, the way two people could find pleasure in each other's company, in whatever form that took. Passion might burn brightly in youth, but in the quiet of later years, it could glow just as warmly. The streets of ancient Greece grow quiet now. The torches outside the houses flicker low, and the last laughter from the taverns fades into the night air. You can almost hear the hush settling over the city, a kind of collective exhale after the day's movement and noise. In the distance, a lone lyre plays a slow, wandering melody. The sound drifts through the warm air, weaving between narrow streets and shaded courtyards. Somewhere, an oil lamp burns softly, casting golden light against smooth walls. Shadows lengthen and blur, the shapes of the day dissolving into the stillness of night. You can imagine yourself walking through that quiet. The stone beneath your feet has cooled after the heat of the day. Above, the stars are clear and bright. The constellations, the same ones the Greeks once named and told stories about. You might pause, tilt your head back, and follow the curve of Orion's belt, or trace the sweep of the Milky Way as it cuts across the darkness. The scent of the air is gentle now, herbs from a nearby garden, the faint salt of the sea carried inland by the night breeze. Each step feels slower, easier, as though time has relaxed its grip. The mind softens too, thoughts becoming lighter, less urgent. Somewhere behind a quiet doorway, two people speak in low voices, their words meant for no one else. You catch only the rhythm of their tones, a private language that needs no translation. It is a reminder that connection, in all its forms, continues quietly even as the world sleeps. The night deepens. The music fades. The stars hold their place. You breathe in, slowly, and let it go, even slower. Sleep well and good night.